Hello, I'm Susan Zink with Montessori for Everybody TV. One of the topics that I get asked about is Montessori education in the context of the other options that parents have. What are the differences between Montessori education and Waldorf, play-based early childhood programs, and the myriad of other programs that are out there? I'm going to give some specific points in regards to Montessori and Waldorf, but I also want to help those of you who are making this important decision understand there is something very specific about Montessori education that you will not find in any other program, if it's truly Montessori education. If it is Monte-something, which is a term that I believe Tim Selden coined, but I'm not entirely sure. I know that he uses it to good effect as he explains Montessori and its benefits. If it is Monte-something, it's not going to have the benefits that I'm talking to you about. True Montessori education has three things that are absolutely essential for it to work with the child. And in this case, I'm going to talk about mostly education for very young children. So we're talking 2 to 6-year-olds, because Montessori programs do have toddler programs for children younger than 3, and that's included in what I'm going to discuss today. If it's truly Montessori education, first and foremost, you have an adult who has been trained, who has put his or her full effort into understanding what true education is. This person has spent months, if not years, preparing to interact with children in a very particular way that treats the child as a human, that treats the child as a complete human, not a mature human, but a complete human being who has rights and has a way of going through their life, a way of doing their own personal work that absolutely deserves our respect. And this is true even of an infant. I'm not going to go too much into that because that's a big topic for another day. But I think as you think about children who are 3, 4, 5 years old, it's pretty easy to realize that they have their own very valid preferences. If they are tired, it's very respectful to organize your day in such a way that they're not being asked to do more than what they can do. These are some everyday ways of extending respect to a very young child. You don't take them for 3 hours at the mall during their nap time. That's just not the best way to look at what that child needs and respect that inherent need. But Montessori takes it to another level. This prepared adult has learned to understand the child's work, to understand what a child wants to do and needs to do to create their own personality. The second thing you're going to find in true Montessori education is a lot of work done by the children, chosen by the children, and repeated and completed at the child's pace and the child's choice. So this would look different from school to school and from country to country. You could have a very authentic Montessori school in a very poor village in Africa. It might not have all of the wonderful materials that most people can have at least some picture of by just doing a search on the internet. It might not have everything that we would like it to have to serve those children learning to work on their own, but it would have the choice that I'm talking about, the occupations the child could do, whether or not it's working with a material that's made of natural things that were found in the environment, that child would be able to work with that material and use it appropriately at their own choice and for as long as that child wanted to use it. This is the second key piece of Montessori education, and the reason it's so essential, the reason it's so key, is that that self-chosen work is what builds a healthy personality. When you concentrate on something that is your own thing, what you've decided to do, and this is true in many ways for adults as well, but especially for children, when you choose that work that you've decided you're going to do and you keep doing it and doing it at your own decision, something happens inside of you. Some kind of organization, some kind of peace inside of yourself begins to become the norm. Dr. Montessori talked about that we didn't even really know what a healthy child was. And the reason that she said that is she said that we hadn't had a chance to do observations of children in an environment that truly served them. How many people would say, oh, we're going to go and study healthy social behavior in a prison? Now, maybe we would study a drug or something like that, or maybe even we would study what we can do to help people stay out of prison. But most of us aren't going to go into that strange artificial environment and try and figure out how healthy people behave. So we need to extend that same courtesy to the child. So we've got 3 things that have to happen for it to be Montessori education. A carefully prepared adult who understands this really unusual way of looking at children. We need to have work that the child is choosing and managing on his or her own. Dr. Montessori talks about the inner teacher. That inner teacher has to be what's running the activities that the child is doing. And then the third piece of Montessori education is a prepared environment. Now, I would suggest that this is one of the places where actually there could be the widest range, particularly in developing countries, to outfit a Montessori environment where it has every single piece of the learning apparatus that Maria Montessori described and tested and refined over decades of work, and that other people who've come after her have done the same with. To have that is expensive, and I won't tell you that it's not. But it does not have to be an either or. It doesn't have to be, oh, you've got to have all this expensive equipment from day one, or you cannot do Montessori education. I would suggest that in developed countries, if you call yourself a Montessori school and you don't have that equipment, you're being disingenuous, and maybe you're even being dishonest. But to do Montessori education is different. And for a child care center to decide we're going to do Montessori education, and when we get to the point where our adults are prepared enough, the children have choice throughout the entire day, or at least 90% of the day, and we have that environment prepared to the level that we believe is appropriate and true Montessori, then we're going to put Montessori school out on our business. That is doing Montessori education in integrity. So, what about some of these other ways? I'm going to talk about Waldorf briefly. Waldorf education is also an education method that has been established for a long time. There are Waldorf schools throughout the world, and it is a more closely controlled method of education than Montessori, because the Waldorf system has kept closer controls on people calling a school a Waldorf school, and there's just probably a little bit more consistency across this method of education. I would suggest that Waldorf education and Montessori education, with few overlapping exceptions, are at odds with each other. And the reason that I say this is that the orientation, the approach to how you bring the elements of fantasy into the child's life, the early childhood environment, are completely different. And this does shape that environment. So if Montessori education requires those 3 things, let's see how that looks in some of these other ways that I'm going to be discussing. So the prepared adult. If you are a Waldorf educator, you have been prepared to do Waldorf education. You've been prepared with a particular orientation to how you approach the child and to what you bring to that child at different ages. And fantasy is a huge part of it. That is one of the things that's very different than Montessori. Now, I'm not going to go into the Montessori idea of fantasy in a lot of depth, but I will tell you it is completely different than imagination. When you bring fantasy to a child, you are telling them a fantastic story. You are telling them a story of dragons and witches and people turning into frogs. That is bringing fantasy into that child's environment. I'm going to suggest that you separate that out from imagination. And for right now, consider imagination to be something that a child initiates, that a child imagines what he or she is going to draw and draws it on the paper. He or she imagines a world that they want to inhabit for a period of time out on the playground, and so they create that playground for themselves. Montessori is all about imagination, even for the very young child, but it's very reality-based for an important reason. Waldorf is very much about bringing that fantasy element in, and animals that talk and do things that animals in our real world don't do is an essential part of that curriculum. But most importantly, what the adults in Waldorf education, and I would suggest almost every form of education other than Montessori and perhaps democratic schools, what those adults have been taught is you teach. You bring the curriculum to the child, and the child takes the curriculum from you and then maybe does some work based on it. This is completely different than Montessori, because remember that middle element of Montessori education, the child choosing of his or her own accord the work that he or she is going to do for most of the day. That's not going to be happening in a Waldorf school. That's not going to be happening in a play-based school for the most part. And I would suggest that that's absolutely essential, that there is an inner teacher in your children, in every child, in every adult, and that unless that inner teacher is allowed to run the show, is allowed to explore with the energy that comes from you choosing the occupation that you're going to do, unless that's happening, true education can't occur. Education is drawing out of the person the brilliance, the gifts that they have to give in the world. And that is the true promise of Montessori education. And then let's look at that last element, the environment. Now, one of the things about a Montessori environment is it was scientifically designed, and increasingly today, in this new millennium, it is increasingly being evaluated scientifically and refined. There is an element of what the adult is expected to do, which is observing and then refining the environment and their approach to the children. This is essential to Montessori. And I would suggest that in Waldorf education, there are sets of art materials, sets of movement materials that are not based on scientific observation of the child. It doesn't mean they're not valid, and it doesn't mean that some of them I have not brought into a Montessori classroom. I have. I think the Waldorf art curriculum is amazing to teach children to use high quality art media well, and then to evaluate their own work over time so that they can increasingly express what they imagine in their minds is wonderful. I completely adore bringing the Waldorf art into any education program because it's wonderful. I think there's a lot of elements of movement in Waldorf that can be brought into other programs. But the idea that you are going to have a set of imaginative materials and art materials, and that things that are reality-based are not necessarily offered to the child. The sensory education that you get in Montessori is not offered to the child at those sensitive periods for developing the hand and the eye and the ear from 3 to 6. If those things are not developed, they may never develop to the level that they potentially could. And this is actually true for working with symbols. This is true with the letters of the child's native tongue alphabet. These are things that Montessori discovered through observing the child. The Montessori environment was based on observation and then refinement, based on what Dr. Montessori saw happening in the children themselves. In Waldorf education, I don't believe that that is something that can be shown to be true. Now, what about all that other stuff out there? What about high scope and academic preschools and play-based preschools? Well, I would respectfully suggest that none of them have those 3 essentials that truly do allow children to educate themselves from an early age. If the environment is based on what an adult thinks the child should learn, if the environment is based on what the adult decides is appropriate due to their philosophy, If the environment is based on just whatever happens to be at hand or is popular in the culture at the time and available in the toy store or the educational supply store, that is not a scientifically prepared environment. And I would suggest we have enough evidence over the course of civilization that the scientific method of observing, noticing what effect things have, and then fighting them based on that is a completely valid and appropriate method of evaluating an early childhood education or anything else. So if you're making that important decision, if you're figuring out, do I want a Waldorf school or a Montessori school or a play-based school for my child, I would suggest that you look carefully at those three elements that I talked to you about and Montessori education as a whole. And the last piece that I do want to mention is Montessori education is sometimes inaccurately lumped into one of two camps of early childhood education, too academic or too free-form. And I would suggest it's neither. The reason that Montessori education, even though letters, numbers, reading, writing are introduced at an early age, the reason it is not too academic is the main reason too academic is a problem is it's developmentally not a fit. If you're asking a 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old to sit there and write on a worksheet, developmentally that's inappropriate. If you are asking that child to work through a reading curriculum you've put together at those ages, developmentally inappropriate. That's not Montessori. Montessori is hands-based, is materials that the children are offered. They are presented and shown how to use and then given the choice to go to them or not. That is developmentally appropriate introduction of language, reading, writing, and the symbols that children really want to learn about, even at an early age. And what about the free-form thing? Well, if it's true Montessori education, it's not too free-form. It's exactly free-form enough, because remember that middle element I talked about. The child has to be able to choose his or her own occupation in order to learn well. But if they're just choosing from junk, that's not an early childhood education. So when you have a carefully prepared environment, you have a carefully prepared adult who guides the children to make best use of that environment, and then you have that free choice, you have exactly the right amount of structure and exactly the right amount of freeform, if you want to call it that. So as you make your decisions about what is best for your child, I want to suggest that maybe Montessori is for everybody. Maybe this is a method that if it is understood and developed appropriately and implemented appropriately, maybe it is the right method of education for every child. In this series of segments on classroom setup, one of the things that I want to focus on is helping you to make sure that you have easily available to you all the things that you're going to need to function effectively, efficiently, and comfortably in your classroom. And it's changed for me over the years what I find that I need in order to do that. When I first started, I had kind of a classroom first aid kit, and that's something that I put together when I was first teaching 35 years ago. And over the years, it kind of changed, and I also found that it was very useful for me to be able to take that as I visited other classrooms, did consulting, or was just helping other people out. Then when I was teaching in schools that had several other colleagues working with me, so I was not only working with what I needed with my own classroom, but maybe helping other people as well, I found that I, over the time, put together 3 kits. My classroom first aid kit that I kind of fleshed out, my toolkit that we're going to talk about in this segment, and a little science kit. And I've used cosmetic cases, other kinds of things that are helpful to kind of keep things that I found myself using over and over again, wanted to have them easy at hand, and that I wanted to have them easy to lend. So this kit had my tools labeled with my name. So if I had a teacher come and say, oh, I really need to repair my bead chains, could I use your tools? I can either lend her a tool, and I kept a little pad that would have a checkout in it, so I knew that Miss Leanne had my jeweler's tweezers or my twisted jewel. I'm not even sure what you call them, but the ones with a bent nose, I guess, is probably close to the accurate name for it. And so I would have a little checkout there. Or if it were somebody that was going to do a whole lot of work, they would just take the whole kit, and I would let them know that they were responsible for making sure everything got back inside. And then the science kit has things like a jeweler's loop, magnifying glasses, test tube brushes, things like that, that I always wanted to have available for any kind of hands-on science that I was doing, and that I kept kind of for myself. It wasn't shelf materials, it was things that if the children used it, they knew that was part of Miss Susan's set, and they would make sure that it got back in the box if they were trustworthy enough to take things out of there. So let's talk about this little toolkit and kind of the way that I've put it together. Over the years, I found for many classrooms, space is a priority, and so some of the things I'm going to talk about are really nice. If you need to have a small kit, if you can have a big toolbox and you've got space for it, that's just fine as well. Now, I have talked in other segments about replacing the jump rings or the little metal rings in bead chains that just come together like that as a metal loop with a split ring, which is a ring where the wire is a little stronger, it kind of loops over itself, and it's kind of like those little rings that you see on key rings, only the size for bead chains. And these are the tools that I use to help repair that kind of thing. And if a ring gets bent out of shape, you can use these and use the two of them together. If you are functioning with the split rings, I do want to give you a little tip about repairs with those. When you have the ring like this, you don't pull the ends of the ring apart, you push them to the side, and then fit whatever you need to back together. Then you can push them a little past where they'll meet and then push them back together, and you'll have a clean repair if you are still working with those kinds of rings. Now, a few of the other things that I like to have in my toolkit, this is an oversized hole punch. So you can get them at scrapbooking stores. So I would guess that it's maybe 3/8 of an inch. My visual for that circle, I didn't think to check it before we started filming, but I think a typical hole punch is about 1/4 of an inch. So if we have a hole that's gotten kind of raggedy in a set of things that are put together with a ring, if you come in with this size hole punch, you can kind of fix that. And if you need to repair the hole entirely, you can use tape to do that, and then repunch it with a slightly larger ring or with a normal size hole punch. So I always have a normal size hole punch in the kit as well. I always have a couple of different kinds of staple removers so that if a book has come apart, I can remove a staple properly and then do the repair. I always have some different kinds of glues, a super glue, usually some kind of like glue dots that are a dry adhesive that can be used to repair things. Some of these things I have in both my toolkit and my first aid kit, depending on what I'm doing. If I have anything in the classroom that has a tool that goes with it, if you have an instrument that has a tool that tunes it, then those would go in your toolkit as well. And if possible, I would suggest consolidating if you do have a small kit like this. So this is a small hammer. It's a Phillips head screwdriver here. It is a smaller Phillips head here, and then I think I have a tiny regular one here. So and of course I'm dropping it. I'm not going to take time to put it back together properly. Now, I have also found in recent years, now this is from the Blue Cannon Company. This is all sorts of things. And I couldn't fit what I needed to in this small toolbox, and I didn't want to go bigger for space reasons. And so you've got pliers, you've got little knife settings,
You've got all kinds of different screwdrivers. There's even a little saw in there. So if you are able, do you have a space problem, this kind of a all-purpose tool is really nice. Now, I got mine for a very low price at a hobby shop when it was on closeout, but I have seen them at regular home improvement stores as well. Let's see if there's anything else. I think the last piece is just a metal letter opener. I found just seems to have all sorts of uses for prying things up or lifting things, just kind of a all-purpose tool. And then if you have any tool-like pieces that you're using with the pieces in your classroom. I had an IKEA shelf that I was fortunate enough that a maintenance person came and tied it into the wall, and so I ended up not using the little hardware that they had for tying a IKEA shelf into the wall, and so I keep that tucked in the toolkit. So I encourage you to put together the tools that you need in a kit form. Makes it easy to keep them where you need them if you need to find them, makes it easier for you to lend them to people. And I don't believe anyone's ever borrowed something from me and intentionally kept it. But I've lost a lot of things because I didn't keep track. So I do encourage you, if you're going to lend out your tools all at once or piece by piece, have a little checkout booklet or a checkout pad so that you can